The hiring manager pressed play, and my brother's voice filled the glass meeting room. I recognized at the moment the first word came through the speaker, that particular steadiness he uses when he has decided something and is carrying it through with confidence. The voice was calm, polite, friendly in the way of someone who has rehearsed friendliness. "Hello," it said. "I'm calling because I think you should know something about Edwina Martins before you hire her." My hands went cold against my knees. The two interviewers exchanged a look across the table, just a glance, brief and controlled, but I caught it. That look carried an entire conversation in about half a second. I felt my heartbeat change, and I kept my face still because the only thing left available to me was to hold my composure until I understood what was happening. He continued. He said that I tended to panic when work became stressful. He said it softly, with what sounded like genuine reluctance, the voice of someone sharing difficult information they wish they did not have to share. Then the message ended. There was a silence in that room that was different from ordinary silence. It had weight to it. The hiring manager set his phone on the table and looked at me with an expression I had not been prepared for. The hiring manager gave me the kindest rejection smile I had ever received. He said I seemed very capable. He said they had to consider all the information available to them. He said he was sure I would find something that was a great fit. Each sentence was polished and careful and delivered with practiced warmth, and each sentence also meant that my own brother had just ended my chance at the most important interview of my career. I nodded. I thanked them for their time. I gathered my folder and my bag, and I stood up with the posture of someone who is absolutely fine. I walked across the marble lobby and pushed through the heavy glass door and stepped out onto the street and let the door close behind me. Then I stopped walking. I stood on the pavement in my interview blazer with people moving around me, and I let myself feel what was actually happening. My hands were shaking. Not from shock. The shock would come later, slow and cold. What I was feeling in that moment was something sharper and more specific. It was fury. The clean, focused kind that does not need to shout because it has already decided what it is going to do. I had spent a year preparing for that interview. My name is Edwina Martins, and until the morning of that interview, I would have described my older brother Oliver as one of the people I trusted most. We grew up in a small house in Kent, 3 bedrooms, a narrow garden, a kitchen where my mother cooked on Sunday afternoons. Oliver and I had shared everything that comes with a life like that, packed lunches, bus routes, the particular closeness that forms between siblings who have nobody else at the same age in the same circumstances. We had kept each other's secrets. We had covered for each other with our parents. We had sat at the same small table and helped each other with homework and talked about what we were going to be when we grew up. I had carried those memories as evidence of who Oliver was. I had used them to override moments of doubt when he said something that did not quite sit right, to excuse patterns I should have examined more carefully. The version of Oliver I believed in was the one built from 29 years of being his sister, and that version made it possible to overlook the other one. Standing on that pavement outside the interview building, I understood that I had been looking at the wrong version for a very long time. The job at Caldwell Strategy was not ordinary. It was a junior analyst position at one of the most competitive management consulting firms in London, the kind of firm that appeared in the financial press regularly, the kind that attracted graduates from the best universities and people with years of experience behind them. I had neither. What I had was a degree in economics, 2 years of administrative experience at a smaller firm, and a determination I had put to work in every free hour for the past 12 months. I had taken 3 online certification courses to make my application stronger. I had attended 4 networking events in industries adjacent to consulting, alone, in rooms full of people who seemed to know each other because someone had told me that the people who got those roles were the people who had been seen before their applications arrived. I had rewritten my cover letter 11 times. I had practiced for the interview until I could answer any version of any question without hesitation. Oliver knew all of this. He knew because I had told him. I had sat at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening 3 months before the interview and told him about the role, what it meant, how hard I had been working, why this particular firm at this particular point mattered to me more than almost anything else I had tried for. He had listened. 2 hours after the interview, my phone buzzed with a message from Oliver. He asked how it had gone with a string of question marks and an emoji that communicated excitement. I read it sitting in a cafe around the corner from the Caldwell building, my coffee going cold, and I understood immediately that the message was not curiosity. He knew how it had gone. He was checking in the way you check in when you have done something and need to know whether it landed. I typed back that it had been fine. Just that, fine lowercase, no punctuation beyond the full stop. He replied with a thumbs up and nothing else. I put the phone in my bag and sat with the silence of the cafe around me and thought about what I actually knew. I knew the voice on that recording was Oliver's. I knew the message had been designed to sound like a concerned party rather than a saboteur. I knew it had worked. What I did not yet know was the reason, not the full reason. Because I had spent the bus ride back replaying the timing, the detail, the content of the message, and what I kept arriving at was a feeling that did not fit the story of simple spite. Oliver did not do things without a reason. He was too careful for that. That evening the interviewer forwarded me a copy of the voicemail, which I had requested when I left, calmly, politely, the way you request something you have an entirely professional reason for wanting. I listened to it again at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a notepad beside me. The first time through I listened for the content. The second time I listened for the details. His tone had been adjusted, slightly lower than usual, slightly more hesitant than the way Oliver normally speaks, the kind of change you would make if you were aware of being recorded and wanted the voice to be harder to place immediately. But he had not been careful enough at the end. He left his contact number, and when he stated his name to go along with it, it was his full name, clear and unambiguous. Oliver James Martins. I wrote it down, even though I did not need to. The arrogance of leaving his real name was not surprising when I thought about it carefully. Oliver had always operated on the assumption that he would not be caught because, in his experience, he generally was not. He had spent years being the older sibling who got away with things by being charming and composed and just difficult enough to challenge. He had built a life on that foundation. It came back to me 3 days after the interview, in the middle of an afternoon when I was doing nothing in particular, a memory from a dinner at Oliver's flat 7 weeks earlier. We had been eating takeaway and he had mentioned, in the distracted way of someone covering that they are thinking about something else, that his company was in competition with Caldwell Strategy for a significant government contract. He said the tender process was ongoing and that the next few months were going to be demanding. I remembered listening and asking a few polite questions, and then the conversation had moved on. At the time I had filed it under ordinary sibling catching up and thought nothing more of it. But sitting now with what I knew about the voicemail, the memory arrived with a completely different shape. If I had joined Caldwell during the period when the two firms were competing for the same government contract, I would have been inside the competing organization. I would not have had access to sensitive information. I would have been entry-level, new, monitored, but Oliver did not know that. Or perhaps he did know it and did not care. Perhaps what he cared about was the principle that his sister being inside a rival firm created a complication he did not want to manage. He had made a decision. I did not call him. I did not send an accusatory message. I did not do anything that would signal I understood what had happened, because signaling understanding before I had what I needed would hand the advantage straight back to him. I saved the voicemail file to 3 separate locations: my phone, a personal email archive, and a USB drive I kept in my desk drawer. Then I sat down and started researching. Oliver worked at Prescott Associates, a mid-sized management consulting firm with offices in Canary Wharf. He had been there for 6 years and held the title of senior consultant. His department dealt primarily with public sector contracts and government advisory work, which was where the overlap with Caldwell's work existed. I looked at the company's public information, their website, their published reports, the profiles of key staff on professional networking sites. Oliver's profile was polished and confident in the way of someone who has thought carefully about how they appear to the world. Then I found what I was looking for. I clicked on the regional director of his department and read the name: Daniel Harrington. I looked at several articles that mentioned him: interviews, conference appearances, a profile piece from a business publication. Every source said the same thing in slightly different words. Daniel Harrington was known for his standards around professional ethics. Rigidly, uncomfortably, publicly known for them. Harrington had given a talk 18 months ago at a business ethics conference. I found the summary of it published on the conference website. He had spoken about the responsibility of senior staff to model ethical behavior and the damage caused when people in leadership positions use their professional position for personal gain. He had said, in a quote that the conference summary reproduced, that a single act of professional misconduct by a trusted employee damaged not just the individual, but the entire organization's credibility. I read that sentence twice. The conference summary also noted that Harrington had, earlier that year, dismissed a department manager at Prescott Associates for a relatively minor ethics violation involving a conflict of interest on a procurement decision. The dismissal had been immediate and had not been reversed on appeal. The article described Harrington as someone who did not make exceptions. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my flat for a moment. What Oliver had done, making a call to a competitor's hiring team, describing their candidate in negative terms, identifying himself in the process, was not a minor ethics violation. It was a direct professional misconduct using his position and his connection to me to interfere with a business rival's hiring. And his boss was a man who had fired someone for something significantly smaller. 3 Sundays after the interview, Oliver messaged asking if I wanted to come for dinner. I said yes. I arrived at his flat at 7 with a bottle of wine I had spent more on than I could easily afford, because I wanted nothing about my appearance or my choices that evening to signal anything other than a sister who had moved past a disappointing interview and was getting on with things. He had cooked a proper meal, which was something he did when he felt guilty, though I had not understood the pattern clearly enough until now. He was warm and easy and asked about my job search with the light concern of someone who wants to appear supportive without saying anything specific. I told him I was still looking. I told him these things took time. I told him I was feeling positive. He nodded and refilled my glass. Partway through the main course he asked, casually and without quite meeting my eyes, whether I had heard anything from Caldwell specifically. I said no, that I thought it had not gone forward after the interview. He made a sympathetic sound. He said these competitive firms were unpredictable. He said something would come along. He smiled the smile he had been using since we were children to smooth over the edges of things he had done. I smiled back. I ate my food. The idea arrived not as a plan, but as a question. I was on the bus to work one morning looking at a jobs board on my phone when I opened a posting on a reflex and stopped scrolling. Prescott Associates was hiring. The role was a data analyst position in the resources and operations team, not Oliver's department, not even on the same floor as his department, but in the same building. It was a grade below what I had been applying for elsewhere. The salary was lower. The role was narrower. On paper, it was a step down from what I was pursuing, and I had enough professional pride to feel the discomfort of that clearly. But I was also looking at it with a different part of my thinking, the part that had been quietly processing the situation for 3 weeks and was now offering me a possibility I had not considered before. If I were inside Prescott Associates, I would not need to manage the situation from the outside. I would be inside the building where Oliver worked. I would have access to the culture of the place, to the way things were discussed, to the specific details that only become visible when you are present in a space. 2 weeks after I submitted the application, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The voice on the other end introduced herself as a member of Prescott Associates' HR team and said they had reviewed my application for the data analyst role and would like to invite me for an interview. I wrote down the date and the time and the address, which I already knew, and thanked her, and ended the call. Then I sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a door opening in the direction you had hoped it might. The interview was in 8 days. Oliver had no idea I had applied. He had no idea the company he worked for had been looking at my CV. I had used my full name on the application, there was no concealing it, and I had not tried to because concealing it would have been dishonest, and I was not willing to build anything on a foundation that required me to hide who I was. If his name came up during the hiring process, if someone at Prescott saw Martins and asked, I had a clean answer ready. We were siblings. I had applied independently without his knowledge because the role was a match for my skills. Both of those things were completely true. The morning of the interview, I walked into the Prescott Associates building for the first time. The reception was wide and light, with a view through glass partitions into a busy open-plan office. Consultants were moving through the corridors with the purposeful speed of people who have more in their day than the day technically holds. I checked in with reception, was given a visitor badge, and waited on a low bench near the lifts. Somewhere above me, on a floor I could not see from where I was sitting, Oliver was at his desk. He did not know I was in the building. He did not know I was sitting 30 meters from the lift that would take me to the same floor where he worked. I had not told him. I had not told anyone in the family. The decision to keep it private until the outcome was determined had been practical. Telling people before I had the job would create pressure and questions and the very specific discomfort of being watched while you attempt something. But sitting in that reception with my folder on my lap and my visitor badge clipped to my blazer, I was also aware that the privacy had a different dimension. I was doing something that Oliver would not have expected from me. The interview lasted an hour and 10 minutes. The panel was 3 people, a hiring manager from operations, an HR representative, and a senior analyst from the data team. We went through the standard territory, my experience, my approach to problems, a scenario exercise involving a data discrepancy in a quarterly report, and I answered everything clearly and specifically, the way I had learned to do after a year of preparing for the Caldwell interview. Toward the end, one of the panel members gathered the papers in front of her and looked at me with a slight change of expression that signals you are moving from the formal section to something more conversational. She asked if I happened to know anyone currently working at Prescott. It was a standard question. Some companies asked it as part of conflict of interest due diligence. Others asked it simply to understand candidate context. I paused for exactly the appropriate amount of time, which was a moment of genuine consideration rather than a stall. Then I said yes. They asked who. I said my brother, Oliver Martins, was a senior consultant in the public sector team. The 3 of them exchanged a brief look, quick, professional, the kind of look that communicates between people who know each other well, without requiring words. Something in the room shifted very slightly. Not negatively. The question about Oliver had not alarmed the panel in the way that might have worried me. What I noticed instead was a particular quality of attention that sharpened in the room, a calibration like people refocusing a lens. One of the panel members wrote something briefly on the notepad in front of her. The HR representative asked a follow-up question. Had I mentioned to my brother that I was applying? I said I had not. I said the decision to apply had been mine independently, that I had found the role through the company's public jobs board, and that I had not informed Oliver, because I preferred to manage my job applications without family involvement. All of that was accurate. The panel nodded, and the conversation moved on to closing questions about my notice period and availability. By the time I walked back through the lobby and returned my visitor badge at reception, the interview itself felt like something I had managed well. What the panel would make of the Oliver detail was something I could not control, and I had learned enough about job applications over the past year to understand that spending energy on the things beyond your control was the most efficient way to drain yourself before the outcome arrived. I walked out into the street and took a different route home than the one Oliver ever walked. I bought coffee. I called a friend. The offer arrived on a Thursday morning at 8:42 while I was still in the earlier part of my workday. The email was from the HR team at Prescott Associates, and the subject line said simply, Offer of Employment, Data Analyst, Resources and Operations. I read it at my desk at the small firm where I had been working while I searched for something better, in an office with a window that looked onto a brick wall. I read the email once all the way through. Then I read it again, more slowly. The salary, the start date, the benefits summary, the attached formal offer letter. I accepted it that same afternoon. Oliver still did not know. I had not told him about the interview, and I had not told him about the offer, and the first time he would discover that his sister was now working in the same building as him would be when he saw me in it. I spent that evening thinking about the timing of what came next. The voicemail was still saved in 3 places. The information I had gathered about Oliver's conduct at the firm, gleaned from that dinner conversation, and confirmed through what I would be able to observe once I was inside, was still sitting in a document on my laptop. Nothing had been sent to anyone. Nothing had been reported. The sequence was not complete yet. My first day at Prescott Associates was a Monday. I had dressed carefully. Not the interview blazer. Something more settled and daily. The clothes of someone who has arrived and intends to stay. The HR induction ran from 9 until noon and covered the standard territory of a new role at a mid-sized firm. In the afternoon, I was shown to my desk in the operations team and introduced to the people immediately around me. Everything was ordinary and unremarkable, and I was paying attention to all of it, building a map of the building and the people and the rhythms of the place that would take weeks to complete. I knew the lift schedule Oliver generally used. He had mentioned it in passing over a year of casual conversations. At 17 minutes past 4, I was at my desk reviewing an orientation document when I heard the lift doors open behind me. I did not look up immediately. I heard footsteps cross the open floor toward the far corridor, heard them slow, heard them stop. Then I heard my name. Not Edwina, just the shortened version Oliver had used since we were children. I looked up. He was standing about 8 meters away with a coffee in one hand and his lanyard in the other, and an expression that I can only describe as someone discovering that the map they have been using is wrong. Within my first week, I noticed something I had not been expecting. Oliver's name came up several times in conversations, not pointed or targeted, just the natural background noise of an office, where people have opinions about the people around them. What I gathered from those conversations, assembled carefully the way you assemble things when you are not asking direct questions, was that Oliver had a habit of taking credit for work produced by people below him on the team. It was not discussed as a scandal. It was discussed as a known fact, something everyone had adjusted their expectations around, the kind of behavior that becomes part of the culture of a place when it has been happening long enough and nothing has been done about it. I stored this. I added it to the document on my laptop. Not because it was directly relevant to the voicemail, it was a separate pattern, but because it drew a fuller picture of who Oliver was when he believed he was operating without consequence. A man who sabotaged his own sister's job interview and a man who regularly claimed other people's work were not two separate people making two separate mistakes. They were the same person operating from the same belief about what he was entitled to and what other people would simply absorb. 3 weeks into my time at Prescott, I overheard something that changed the scale of what I thought I was dealing with. I was in the kitchen area near the end of the day, making tea, and listening to a conversation happening in the corridor outside. Not deliberately, but because the acoustics of the space made it unavoidable, and the words reached me clearly. Oliver was talking to someone I did not recognize. He was telling a story about something he had managed, and the story had the loose, expansive quality of someone speaking without thinking about who might be nearby. He said, specifically, that he had stopped his sister from getting hired at Caldwell Strategy. The person he was speaking with asked what he meant. Oliver said it was a family competition thing, and laughed. The word he used was family competition. Not a mistake, not a complicated decision, not something he regretted. A competition. As if my career were a game, and he had simply moved a piece that was in his way. I stood at the counter and let the tea steep for the appropriate time, and it did not change anything about my posture or expression. Then I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop and added a line to the document. Direct admission of conduct. Stated voluntarily in workplace environment. Date and time noted. That evening I opened the document and went through everything it contained from the beginning. The saved voicemail file, with the name clearly stated at the end. My notes from the Caldwell interview and the way the panel had responded. The research I had done on Daniel Harrington and his public position on professional ethics. The patterns I had observed at Prescott, the credit-taking, the casual assumptions about what he could and could not do without consequence. The overheard admission in the kitchen corridor. And then there was one more layer I had been building for the past 2 weeks, the one I had been most careful about. Oliver sat on 2 internal project teams at Prescott that dealt with government tender processes. I had been doing data work for the operations team and had noticed, in the datasets I was reviewing, certain irregularities in how project timelines and resource allocations were being recorded. On their own, they meant nothing. In the context of Oliver's role on those tender teams and the specific contract that Caldwell had been competing for, they meant something that I was not qualified to interpret, but that someone more senior most certainly would be. I added this to the document. The document now covered a voicemail recording, a direct workplace admission of sabotage, credit-taking conduct, and potential data irregularities connected to a competitive tender process. I closed the laptop. What I found in the data was not on its own a smoking gun. I want to be precise about this because precision mattered. The irregularities were in how resource allocation figures were being logged against project codes, amounts that did not match the official tender submission records I had managed to cross-reference through documents I had legitimate access to as part of my operations role. The discrepancy was not enormous. It was the kind of discrepancy that could be explained several ways, and I was not in a position to determine which explanation was correct. But the discrepancy existed in a dataset that Oliver's team had submitted and that bore his authorization signature in a period that overlapped with the Caldwell tender competition. What I was looking at might have been a recording error. It might have been a procedural mistake. Or it might have been something more deliberate. The use of internal company records to misrepresent resource capacity in a way that gave Prescott a competitive advantage in the tender process. I did not know which it was. But I knew that Daniel Harrington, a man who had dismissed a manager for a minor conflict of interest violation, a man who had spoken publicly about the responsibility of senior staff to model ethical conduct, would want to know about the discrepancy and would have the authority and the access to find out exactly what it meant. I requested a meeting with Daniel Harrington through the standard internal scheduling system, listing the meeting subject as a matter relating to professional conduct I wanted to raise confidentially. His assistant responded within a day and offered 15 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. The meeting felt significant, and I wanted to treat it that way, so I prepared the same way I would prepare for an important interview, the document printed and ordered, the voicemail queued on my phone, the specific facts I intended to raise arranged in a sequence that would be clear to someone hearing them for the first time. I had not told Oliver. He did not know I had requested the meeting. He had continued, in the weeks since my arrival, to behave around me with a combination of wariness and forced normality, acknowledging me when our paths crossed in the way of someone managing a situation rather than navigating a relationship. He had not apologized. He had not attempted to explain. He had simply recalibrated, the way he always recalibrated when something went differently from how he expected, and gone on doing what he did. I walked into Harrington's office on Thursday afternoon and sat down in the chair across from his desk and took a breath. The document was in the folder. My phone was in my hand. Harrington was exactly as his public profile suggested, contained, attentive, the kind of professional who does not give away their response until they have heard everything they need to hear. He listened without interrupting while I explained the sequence. The Caldwell interview, the voicemail, the discovery that the caller was my brother, Oliver Martins, who worked in his department. I did not use emotional language. I described events in the order they happened, referenced the specific dates where I had them, and explained the professional nature of my concern, that what Oliver had done constituted an interference with a competitor firm's hiring process, using his connection to me to disadvantage a company his own firm was competing with for a government contract. Then I slid my phone across the desk. I said I believed he should hear the recording. He picked up the phone. He pressed play. The room filled with Oliver's voice, calm, friendly, describing me as someone who panicked under pressure, leaving his own name clearly at the end. Harrington listened all the way through without moving. When it finished, he set the phone down with the careful deliberateness of someone who is controlling their response. I placed the folder on the desk and said there were additional matters in the document that I thought were relevant to his oversight of the team. Then I waited. The investigation that followed was neither quiet nor quick, but it was thorough, and Harrington ran it the way his reputation had suggested he would, without exception-making and without the softening that sometimes happens when the subject of an investigation is a long-standing employee who has been useful to the organization. The voicemail was the first thing formally addressed. Oliver had used his position and his knowledge of a family relationship to interfere with a competitor firm's hiring process during a live tender competition, which violated several sections of Prescott's conduct policy, as well as creating a professional liability for the firm. The data irregularities were referred to the compliance team and investigated separately. During that process, documentation emerged that pointed to Oliver having misrepresented resource figures in the tender submission in a way that was not accidental. The investigation found 3 separate conduct violations. He was removed from his project teams in the first week. He was suspended with pay in the second week, pending the outcome of formal procedures. By the end of the month, the suspension had been converted to termination. He did not appeal. I do not know whether he understood that appealing would have required him to argue against evidence that included his own voice, his own name, and his own signature on documents that did not match the records I had cross-referenced. I suspect he understood perfectly well. 3 months after Oliver's termination, I received an email from a senior recruiter at Caldwell Strategy. She said she had heard through the professional network about the work I had been doing in the operations team at Prescott Associates, and that Caldwell was currently building out its junior analyst team and would be interested in having a conversation. She asked if I was open to an exploratory discussion. I read the email on a Sunday morning at my kitchen table with a coffee beside me. I had been at Prescott for 4 months by then. I had been promoted once. The work had been harder than the role description suggested, and I had been better at it than I expected, and both of those things had turned out to be precisely what I needed. I replied to the recruiter that same day and said I would be happy to meet. The conversation turned into an interview. The interview turned into a second interview. The second interview turned into an offer, which arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and which I accepted before the close of business that day. When I walked into the Caldwell interview room the second time, everything about the experience was different from the first. There was no voicemail. There was no sabotage. There was no moment where I had to hold my composure against the weight of something I had not been told was coming.